I think I will just briefly introduce myself for those who don't know me. I'm Carolina. I'm Portuguese and I live in Portugal. I worked for UNITAR as a project assistant. I previously worked for the Portuguese Ministry of National Defense in Atlantic Center. That's a maritime organization. And now I also work in the maritime sector in UNITAR. I work for the Division for Peace in Brussels. So I was invited to moderate this incredible panel in this awesome webinar. So I think, yeah, now we can get started. We have 33 participants. So welcome all and thank you for joining us. As you saw, we are opening this webinar for gender responsive protection of civilians from legal frameworks to community-based strategies. Today with us, we have 4 speakers, among them 2 special guests. I would ask our speakers to introduce themselves. I think we can start with Roberta.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Yes, my name is Roberta Clark and I'm from the Caribbean, currently living in Trinidad and Tobago. In the context of this session, I'm also a lawyer working for gender equality and social justice through the feminist movement in my region and in my country. I have been engaged with UN Women for quite a long while, and I see that Joanne Sandler has put together a UN Women reunion here, because I think all 4 of us have had some past association with UN Women, but I did work in various regions of the world for quite a long time. I'm currently a commissioner on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and also currently the president of the commission, as well as the rapporteur for the rights of women, as well as the rapporteur for the rights of LGBTI persons, and really very honored to have been invited to be here alongside with Joanne, with Hiba, and with Marie Goretti. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolina. I guess I should just jump in. Also, thank you to UNITAR. Yeah. Thank you to UNITAR for inviting us. I'm a very proud member of Diplomats Without Borders. And also, I was very fortunate to have an epiphany in my early 20s that my purpose in life was to work for women's rights and gender equality transnationally. And 50 years later, I have to say, fortunately and unfortunately, that purpose remains as important now as it was when I first thought about it. And so there have been amazing strides, and also we still have so much to do. I am also incredibly honored to be here with Roberta and Goretti and Heba. I was the former deputy executive director of UNIFEM, where the 3 of us worked together. And then was also on the transition team to establish UN Women. I'm currently a senior associate with a transnational group called Gender at Work that works with organizations to create cultures of equality in many different parts of the world. And I continue to work with vibrant feminist and women's networks all over. And I want to also now invite Heba and then Goretti to introduce themselves. So over to you, Heba.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And it is indeed a pleasure to be with all the esteemed panelists and speakers of today, also colleagues from UNIFEM and from also the journey that UN Women has. My name is Hiba Zayan. I'm currently the Regional Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Advisor at the Regional Office for the Arab States, based in Cairo. And then maybe I pass it on to
Goretti.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be part of this panel. I'm Marie Goretti Nduwayo. I'm the country representative of UN Women in Haiti currently, and I have been with UNIFEM, as Joanne was saying, since '98. and was the first representative of UNIFEM in Burundi since '98, where I was directly supporting the women involvement in the Arusha peace talks, the protection of women in IDP, in refugee camps, as well as within local communities. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you all for your introductions. And thank you again for being here with us to provide us with knowledge in speaking about the great importance of the subject we are going to discuss now. So I must say that over the past 20 years, there has been an ever-expanding body of international laws, normative agreements, guidance, and some others to conceptualize and practice gender-responsive protection within broader peace and security, and also humanitarian agreements. And these have arisen largely because of the advocacy and courage of feminist networkers and gender equality advocates within and outside the UN system. They were demanded in an era that is very far different from the one that we live in today. So I open the questions to the chat as well. Please feel free to ask any questions. I leave the question, are they still relevant? And I think we can start with Roberta. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone online from all over the world. Good day, good night. I think I want to start off by recalling the first time I'd heard about violence against women and girls in the context of war and armed conflict. I was a child, and it was through a televised adaptation of a Somerset Maugham short story called The Unconquered. The Unconquered. And that story told the tale of a rape of a French girl by a German soldier and her determination to hold him to account morally, withholding her forgiveness, insistently withholding her forgiveness for what was unforgivable, and also, importantly, unpunished. This story of violence against women, its impunity, in the context of armed conflict, represented the untold story of millions of women in the war years in Europe. Everywhere, in fact, where there has been and currently is armed conflict, international or internal, women and girls are the targets of specific types of violations made more possible by pre-existing and persistent gender inequality. Sexual violence against women and girls is not just a byproduct of war. It is typically a deliberate strategy. Sexual violence as an expression of power and control is used to terrorize women and girls and fragment and destabilize communities. Working through UN Women in the context of, for example, Libya, South Sudan, Somalia, Myanmar, Afghanistan, being close enough to observe those countries and the conflicts in those countries, it's very clear that women suffer and continue to suffer very specific harms. And now we're in a period of significant regression, and we can talk about that later on. Yet, it is only relatively recently the scale, the meaning, and the consequences of violence against women and girls in conflict has been acknowledged. The urgent demand for prevention and protection listened to, and the centrality of women and girls being supported to be agents of prevention, protection, and response better understood. So this seminar asks us, why do we need gender-responsive protection? Simply, when crises strike, when conflict opens up, gender inequality is exacerbated. I found out some time ago, we talk about women being vulnerable to violence, and it drove me to sort of look at the origin of the word vulnerable, because I really don't like it. I prefer risk and not harm and threatened. But vulnerable is derived from a Latin noun called vulnus, which is the wound. So we know that vulnerability has something to do with a pre-existing injury. And the pre-existing injury that women experience is the injury, the assault, the insult of persistent gender inequality, which is expressed ordinarily in violence against women, also in women's marginalization and exclusion from power and decision-making. So we know that violence and insecurity, already high pattern for women, increases as already fragile protection mechanisms deteriorate in the context of conflict. The 2024 Secretary General's report on Women, Peace and Security tells us that in 2023, Amid record levels of conflict, the proportion of women killed in armed conflict doubled between 2022 and 2023. The number of United Nations verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence was 50% higher than the year before. And the number of girls affected by grave violations in situations of armed conflict increased by 35%. UN Women tells us that 500 women and girls die in conflict-affected countries every day due to complications with pregnancy and birth. So we know that we are facing regressions in women's rights. We know that progress has been disturbingly slow in terms of ending impunity for those who perpetrate atrocities against women and girls. And as the Secretary General's report accurately laments, increased geopolitical divisions make it difficult, near impossible, to advance comprehensive solutions to conflict. In so many places, instead of diplomacy and mediation, more government, more non-state actors are reverting to military action and arms proliferation. So the equality between and within states and peace and security agendas are needed like never before, and I think we would all agree to that. In this seminar, we'll be sketching out the protection, at least I will be, for my part, be sketching out the protection and conflict framework with a focus on women and girls. The duties of states to protect civilians are outlined in international human rights law as well as in international humanitarian law. International human rights law lays down the obligations of states to act in certain ways or to refrain from acting and to promote and protect human rights. So we say protect, respect, and fulfill rights. That's the state. Those are the state duties here. International human rights law applies to all contexts, including conflict. So, for example, the prohibition against torture, which is part of international human rights law, very much applies to conflict, and we see, of course, it is routinely derogated from. International human rights law, on the other hand, is a set of rules which seek, for humanity reasons or humanitarian reasons, to limit the effects of armed conflict. So not to stop armed conflict, but to limit the effects of armed conflict. Humanitarian law protects people who are not or no longer participating in the hostilities and restricts the means and methods of warfare. So international humanitarian law speaks to how force may be used and against whom, but not the legitimacy of the use of force. Specific to attention to women, the Fourth Geneva Convention in 1949 gives women both general protection as civilians and specific protection as women. The Geneva Convention addresses general non-discrimination in that protected persons are to be treated similarly and without adverse distinction founded on, amongst other categories, sex. The Geneva Convention also outlines specific protections for civilian women against sexual violence and protection of pregnant women and mothers. On gender-based violence, in the Fourth Geneva Convention, it is provided that women shall be especially protected against any attack on their honor, and I want you all to reflect on that word, on their honor, against rape, enforced prostitution, or any form of indecent assaults. The articles of the additional Protocol 1 and 2 prohibit outrages against personal dignity. Again, let's reflect on the language, outrages against personal dignity, in particular, humiliating and degrading treatment, enforced prostitution, and any form of indecent assault. So the language used in these conventions, references to honor, for example, have been vehemently criticized by feminist scholars and feminist humanitarian activists. Because according to one of our real feminist icons, Rhonda Copeland, now deceased, such language reinforces the social view, also internalized by women, that the raped woman is the dishonorable one, not the one who's perpetrating the rape, but the one who is actually being violated. The language of honor obfuscates, and she says even dignity in this context, obfuscates the fact that rape is fundamentally violence against women, violence against women's bodies, women's autonomy, their integrity, and their security. And the words do not fully capture the harm done. The words in the Geneva Convention, honor, for example, do not fully capture the harm done. Indecent, what was the last one? Indecent assault. Do not fully capture the harm done, and they do not indicate that sexual violence is a crime of the gravest dimension. References to honor, the feminist scholars tell us, and we know it, so we can feel it, references to honor diminish the harm and perpetuate detrimental stereotypes. Because of these analyses and the feminist organizing, rape is now defined as a grave breach of humanitarian law, as a war crime, as crimes against humanity, not just rape, sexual violence, as war crimes and crimes against humanity, through the jurisprudence from the 2 ad hoc international criminal tribunals set up to judge serious crimes committed in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The statute of the International Criminal Court also includes reference to rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, and any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. This definition of both crimes against humanity and war crimes over which the ICC has jurisdiction, both in international and non-international armed conflicts. And I wanted to say that in particular because I referenced Rhonda Copeland. She was one of the architects of something called the Women's Caucus for Gender Justice, which worked very, very strongly in demanding that the Rome Statute, which establishes the ICC, fully captures the realities of women, the harm suffered by women in the context of conflict. So beyond a focus on gender-based violence, and because of the work of the women's movement, starting with Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, there are now a number of UN Security Council resolutions calling for international political accountability for addressing the differential impacts of conflict and war on women. These resolutions seek to make visible the impacts and also center, very importantly, women as agents of peace building. So combined, the resolutions call on the international community to do 3 things in the main. 1, to promote and support women's active and meaningful participation in conflict prevention and conflict resolution mechanisms and institutions. 2, to promote and safeguard the human rights of women and girls and to take measures to protect them from sexual and gender-based violence in the situation of armed conflict. And 3, to promote women's equal access to relief and recovery distribution mechanisms and services and ensure that their specific needs are considered. Security Council Resolution 1325 and the associated resolutions are very much the products of the advocacy around women's rights and gender mainstreaming activism. And to date, I think as of May this year, 79 countries have established national action plans on women, peace, and security to advance this agenda. And often this is driven by women's movement acting in concert with national gender machineries of the state. In addition to these resolutions, the UN has also devised a protection of civilians framework, which calls for physical protection, for dialogue with affected communities, dialogue and engagement with affected communities, and the establishment of a protective environment, making the UN and its peace operations directly accountable to those it interacts with. In repeated Security Council resolutions on the protection of civilians, the Security Council has agreed on the importance of mainstreaming gender and has called for meaningful participation of women and women's organizations at the forefront of any protection of civilian strategy. But guess what? In 2023, only 9.6% of peace negotiators were women. So for all of this Security Council resolutions, for the protection of civilian resolutions, for the attention to women, peace, and security, we see things have not fundamentally changed. Yet, women continue to be agents of change, and in the face of terror, tragedy, and international indifference, they remain on the front lines, protecting their children, their families, and their communities. And today we have with us 2 women who have been up close to the work of women demanding to be heard, demanding accountability, demanding security for their communities. And I'm really happy, Joanna and myself are very happy that we are joined here by Hiba and Marie Goretti. And with that, I will stop talking and turn over back to Carolina. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think, as you said, it's very, very important to listen and to worry about the frameworks and the legal part, the legal aspect of the gender and equality. And I think to speak a little bit about gender responsive protection in the Middle East Hiba, please, I will give you the floor, and I will start by asking you, what are the operational challenges in applying legal protections or gender responsive protection strategies for women and other vulnerable groups in the conflict zones you've studied, and how can these challenges be mitigated? Please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and also many thanks to Roberta for also sharing the importance of the framework around issues of protection. And I have to say, I mean, in a direct answer to your question, definitely what is most challenging is the nature of conflicts themselves. As we know that the way conflicts are unfolding, affecting a number of countries already in the region, and of course, conflicts are causing, protracted humanitarian crises in the context of a number of countries. Palestine is one of them. Of course, Lebanon now is one of them. Sudan is one of them, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, and of course it doesn't only affect those countries, and Syria, of course, but it also affects neighboring countries. So the region is definitely, unfortunately, very much affected by these conflicts, and those crises that are resulting from those conflicts are, in my opinion, at heart protection crises, meaning that in order for us to also think of what should be done when it comes to women's protection under a situation of armed conflict, we have to also understand the impact of the absence of protection on women's and girls' lives, what it means, how it starts, and how there is this big intersection when it comes to gender-specific vulnerabilities between protection and almost everything else that impacts women. So, for instance, we've started sometimes with those crises in the region that resulted in major displacement waves, right? Like the situation in Syria, or now the situation in Palestine and Lebanon. And then when we are interviewing women, they centralize the concept of losing shelter, safe haven, house, home, the place that they've owned and known for so many years. And then all of a sudden you become away from not only your house, depending on if you lose the house or not lose the house, but the whole experience of being completely pushed away from the place you feel most protected, which is, as we know, a personalized, individualized perception, if you will, around protection, where people feel safe. And then not only it relates to going into the unknown, but also dismantling everything that surrounds also the neighborhood, the extended family, the people that are surrounding these women in their local communities, because of how displacement unfolds and unpacks. People go into different directions, into different localities, and then because there is this instinct of survival, then very, very different options are usually pursued by women who've gone through the displacement experience, whether it's cross-border displacement, meaning they become refugees in another country, or it's an internal displacement situation. So when we think of displacement and the loss of shelter, then the immediate issue around that loss of shelter becomes this feeling of being, violated, right? Like your rights are being violated, your privacy is being violated, your dignity is being violated. And that's why the more we document in the Arab States region experiences of displaced women that have been either into overcrowded households or in IDP, shelters, etc., the more they speak of this. I mean, my dignity, my privacy, my even modesty is being completely affected by being placed in those situations where, again, much of that is very much compromised. Then we go to every other type of service response that is needed to be sought by women in either displacement situations or in situations where their security is being risked and jeopardized. Let's assume it's a health-related service. And then the journey for instance, for either pregnant women or women who have other diseases such as non-communicable diseases who need treatment. And then the journey to seek the service under situations, for instance, of heavy bombardment or under situations of armed conflict becomes also a journey of impacted, defined by loss of protection. Same goes for food security. And when you come to think of it, you find that choices made by families, for instance, who receives the assistance, who goes and finds the assistance and seeks the assistance, is governed very much in those situations by this perception of, again, lack of protection, who is willing to risk. And that's why we see now with gender alerts that we've been developing on Gaza and the one that we've developed on Lebanon, that there is much of the decision making, even at a household level, is governed again by the family trying to negotiate a scenario of, seeking some of the safest options. Who is safe to seek this service? Is it the woman? Is it the men? Does that eventually have results also for men and boys, putting them in, risk situations? Because of, again, how everything around the situation of the conflict, again, risks and violates the protection of the individuals and the protection of civilians. And it's important, I think, to note here that much that was documented in, conflict settings did focus on conflict-related sexual violence, as Roberta mentioned, which is important, which is central, which is key, which is a grave violation that needs to be, for all basically types of purposes, if you will, reprisal, all of that needs to be documented. But at the same time is not the only violation, as we know, that is attached to the protection of civilians or lack of protection of civilians in a conflict situation. I mean, of course, there is an increase of gender-based violence in all situations where we have, risks and vulnerabilities impacting women and girls. Some, of course, there is a lot that has been also discussed in this context around why would that increase, what the reasons behind that, if the crisis is affecting everyone, of course, differently, but at the same time, everyone is rendered vulnerable. But then again, much of what we see after is based on the pre. And that's why we keep saying, when is it a good time to do a gender analysis? And then the answer would be always. Always it's important to do a gender analysis. It's important to capture a snapshot of, relations, opportunities, risks, roles, etc., in a certain community. Because what happens is that after we have a situation of conflict, everything that was before in terms of, again, women's access, for instance, to services, women's access to legal aid, the existence of adequate, services and structures, their economic situation, participation in the labor force, etc. All of a sudden, when a crisis hits, much of the issues, and of course, we would not forget social norms, patriarchy, etc. The impact of all of that on the situation of women and girls becomes magnified, because eventually, again, if they did not have access to that before the war or before the conflict, then it's most likely a situation that they would struggle after the war, after the conflict. And that's why we need to understand what was before to also understand what happened after. It doesn't mean that we cannot, of course, capture the impact of the conflict at a certain period of time without having the before information, but that gives us a better also reading into much of the trends, much of the risks, and much of the vulnerabilities that are expected when a scenario or a situation like that hits. And that's why an investment at a community level, through our programs, in women's ability to convene, to respond, to assess, is very important. And the programs that had a very strong, in my opinion, localized lens, were some of the best practices in the region, some of the best examples, and I'll mention some of them in a minute, to actually be leveraged, let me put it this way, during either a humanitarian crisis situation, either sudden onset conflict or a protracted crisis situation, because again, they depend very much on supporting, you know, local capacities and abilities and voices and perspectives in providing the needed responses and services to the communities out there. And some of those, to be honest, good examples that I've seen was around access to justice and legal aid. And having a system, for instance, that is available for women to report a legal issue or seek legal counseling in, let's say, even if it's a protracted crisis, but it's not an acute conflict situation. And then having, you know, trained lawyers, having legal clinics, having information, so women's access to information about the services, them being able to seek the services, talk to people, usually having structures in place that are, again, close to the community, known by the community, led by women themselves, led by women who know the community and known by the community. Once you have, again, the conflict hit, it was way easier to actually leverage those structures. Maybe one might ask, but then how can we have legal aid under a situation of, let's say, bombardment, like the situation that is in there, or you know, again, intense conflict situation? It doesn't have to be for legal aid. And that's why it's important for us understanding why we need to have women themselves providing protection services to the civilians or to women civilians in their areas, or to the population at large, depending, of course, on the service. Because once you have that structure functioning, and then the crisis hits or the conflict hits, people would, for instance, come to you with loss of documentation. Very important. If people lose their documents, they cannot seek food, right? They cannot get food parcels or hygiene kits or whatever that's being provided during the conflict. So it's very important for services like that. Yes, they're not going to court with legal suits, but they are able definitely to provide a level of support that can support groups of vulnerable women and girls access services. Same around later on, as we understand, when there is relief and recovery or a recovery phase, when you have house, land, and property rights issues, people cannot prove, especially when we have major house demolitions. So people cannot prove, particularly women widows, their ownership of their houses before they were demolished. So it's very important that you have structures in the community where they can report, get some support, and then continue to receive the support throughout until there is hopefully a cessation of hostilities, and then women can later on benefit from that support one way or another. So this is definitely one example. A second example coming to mind from WPS, all the networks that we have around, you know, local women peace builders who've done early warning systems. I mean, these usually early warning systems, as we know, were associated and linked with several issues, sometimes to conflict, intercommunal conflict prevention, sometimes to climate, sometimes. But once again, you have the population affected, we can always use the same women that are trained as community mediators, as community local peace builders, participate in relief and recovery committees, right? Participate in humanitarian action committees, where they meet with decision makers, they meet with affected populations of women, they meet with women-led organizations, and they negotiate, right, the response. How the response is it gender responsive enough? Is it inclusive enough? They can bring in local perspectives. They can ask for participation in decisions that affect camps. And we've seen much of that in Jordan around the Syrian crisis, where we have camp settings and then women participating to inform camp committees and so on and so forth. So I think that much of the support that can be given to support gender responsive protection of civilians does need analysis, you need information, then you need partnership with women-led organizations and with women groups, and you need, again, a very strong localized perspective to protection, where services can be provided for women, by women, and by women-led structures. I think I was disconnected, but I was coming to the end of my presentation.
Yeah.
So I think I'll leave it there, and I think I took more time than should. Would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiba, for your great presentation. Now we will go to Goretti on the same question on gender responsive protection, but in East Africa and Haiti. So Goretti, I will ask you again, what are the operational challenges in applying legal protections on gender responsive protection strategies for women and other vulnerable groups in the conflict zones you've studied as well? And how can these challenges be mitigated? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolina. I think I will be short because I know participants will need more time for questions, but I'm going to share my experience using the case of the Burundian Civil War, which began in 1993 as an ethnic conflict. The prolonged period of violence and rebellion resulted in widespread human rights abuse, particularly against women and children. And the conflict created a dire need for effective legal protection and gender-responsive strategies to safeguard the right and well-being of the most vulnerable population. So, about the challenges, I think we faced many challenges, starting with the patriarchal norms, because that was the big challenge. Because as you know, in most patriarchal societies, efforts to enforce legal protection were frequently undermined by prevailing societal norms that devaluate the right and voices of women, where you can feel that women don't have a space. And this was confirmed when we came to negotiations, where all negotiators were men. So no woman was there because for them, it was not a place for women. So we also consider a lack of awareness and the limited education of women, especially at community level, about legal rights among women and vulnerable groups, further complicated the application of the protection because many women were not informed about their legal entitlements or the mechanisms available to seek justice and protection. We had to go through sensitization campaigns to show women that, no, look, that's not a normal life you might live because you have rights and you need to know your rights. And the weak legal framework, such as judiciary system, was plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and a lack of independence, making it difficult to uphold legal protection for women and vulnerable groups. This is something which is similar with what I'm seeing here in Haiti. It's really, yes, Burundi is in Africa, Haiti is in Caribbean region, but I can see the link between the same challenges. Then political instability did not make it easy due to frequent changes in leadership, and this is the case in Haiti as well, and governance structures led to inconsistent policies and the lack of continuity in protection strategies. we may have discussed with the minister, for instance, and agree on how we work with civil society to strengthen their capacities and their protection. But 3 months or 6 months later, the government will change and we will have to start the same process. So the volatile political environment also diverted attention and resource away from addressing the plight of vulnerable population. Now, access to women and vulnerable groups was critical because humanitarian organizations and legal aid providers faced significant challenges in reaching this population, hindering the delivery of essential services and support. A concrete example in Burundi, in Haiti, is that all the roads are blocked. How can you access this population, this vulnerable population to whom you would like to provide assistance? So the lack of infrastructure and security exacerbated these logistical constraints, leaving many women without access to legal protection. Now, lack of resources is something which hampered the effort of both governmental and non-governmental organizations working to protect women and other vulnerable groups. And the scarcity of resources often led to prioritization of immediate humanitarian needs over long-term legal and protection initiatives. That's why we will be considered as not needed in the time of humanitarian, because food is the most needed, water is the most needed, while protection of women's rights is also one of the priorities. For us, working with community organization and developing relationship with men and women, boys and girls at community level was something we realized really supported the process, because when you don't have women present, at least you could count on men or leaders, leader communities, so that services are provided to women. So I think I will stop it here because I know we have many questions, but I can confirm that by involving community members in the development and implementation of protection strategies, where initiatives created more sustainable and effective solution, because once they are part of it, they will be able to feel they are involved and they can share what they have and then create something sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Goretti and Heba, for this more localized perspective. Thank you very much. Now, we will go to Joanne, and maybe we can talk about the priorities for enhancing protection of civilians, including the inclusive strategies to bring in men and LGBTQ community in consideration and others from a gender equality and women's rights perspective. So, Joanne, I will ask you, what are the priorities that women peace builders and women's human rights defenders have articulated in terms of strengthening gender responsive protection of civilians? And I will ask you as well, how can gender responsive approaches to the POC be integrated into peace building processes? And what impact will that have on fostering long-term gender equality? Please.
Thank you, Carolina. And I think listening to Heba and Marigoretti and Roberta already answers some of those questions. I'm going to be very quick so that people have an opportunity to express their own questions, and I see them in the chat. And I want to start actually by quoting the UN Women Goodwill Ambassador when she addressed the Security Council in April 2024, Danai Gurira, because what she said is, how can we counter the $2.4 trillion of military spending and record weapon sales when we take all bilateral aid supporting feminist, women-led, and women's rights organizations and movements in conflict countries? We do not even get to $150 million for the last year for which we have data. That is 0.01% of global military spending. And Roberta talked about how many women have been in peace negotiations, and Heba and Goretti have shown dramatically how effective women can be both at preventing conflict and then responding to the worst situations. And so I would say very quickly that the issue really is a mindset change. We need a mindset change. And one of the first mindsets, and I think women's human rights defenders, women's peace builders, and feminist organizations have been talking about these things. The situation has changed radically since 25 years ago when we talked about Security Council Resolution 1325. What is it that we need to do now to update the demands? And one thing is we need to focus on prevention, instead of always having to look at protection. And focusing on prevention means supporting the very kinds of groups that Heba and Goretti are talking about, because they are the groups that will help to prevent these conflicts from happening in the first place. If situations in Haiti and Gaza and Sudan and other places had been addressed, we might not be where we were. So if women had been leaders in addressing these, that would be different. Number two, and Goretti made this point to me yesterday, data. And Heba talked about how important it is to collect data so we actually know what is happening on the ground. Gender sensitive data, like the kind that UN Women put out in January 2024. Very quickly, there's this notion, well, in the middle of a conflict, how do you collect data? We see examples of how that happens, and we need to invest in that. The third is what we've all talked about, that yes, women experience discrimination on the basis, and others on the basis of gender, but we can't see women and other types of gender discrimination as only victimization because of violence. We have to see all those communities as agents of change and agents of protection. And again, that comes back to creating seats at the table, and not just seats, putting these communities, women's rights leaders, women's human rights defenders, and peace builders at the head of the table to help to create the kinds of policies and practices that are going to prevent violence from happening and conflict from happening, and also respond when it does. And finally, I will say that women's human rights defenders, women peace builders face unique dangers. As they do their work, we need to resource their strategies for collective protection, and also to make sure that they are the ones who are leading the charge for peace, rather than bringing the warring parties to the table and expecting them to come up with a solution that they could never have come up with in the first place. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Joanne. So maybe now we can go to the Q&A, and I will read some of the questions the participants made, and maybe we can just cover some points that missed here. So I will read the first question. It's from Fiza Nizami. And the question is more directed to Roberta, but if you all want to jump in and add something, please go ahead. I want to know, I am an advocate here in Pakistan, but we girls face too much discrimination at every step at the workplace. Are they also face the same, or there is equality at the workplace?
I think we're all a little surprised. Is the question, is there inequality in the workplace in other parts of the world? Yes, yes. I'm so sorry if that's a question.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry to say, it's sad to say, but I think this is a global phenomenon. Even where there are laws, and there's a whole legal structure that should be in place to guarantee equality in the workplace, including, for example, paying attention to women's specific needs for maternity leave with pay, for social protection, for equal pay for equal work, for non-discrimination in employment, not just based on sex and gender, but sexual orientation. I think, so even when the legal framework is in place, I think there's also the culture of discrimination, the culture of discrimination that finds its way, bursts through the legal framework so that there's inequality persisting. But I don't want to be completely pessimistic, because I do think laws really support the demand. Laws that can be enforced support the demand for equality. But yes, this is a continuing global issue.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, or I'll go to the next question. Joanne?
No, I was agreeing to go to the next question.
Okay, great. So this one is from Ekunda Ohur Chuku, and I will just let everyone know that we are going to stay maybe some more minutes so we can cover another question. Okay, so this one is from Ekunda Ohur Chuku, and the question is, how or what monitoring strategies or mechanisms does the UN Women's System have to monitor and recognize states that constantly violate women's rights because they're unrecognized and are unable to be held accountable? And then he gives an example of North Cyprus that is unrecognized with the longest protected conflict, where foreign women are exploited, but there's no effective mechanism to ensure monitoring and accountability. Do they get away with these violations because they're in recognized states? Maybe we can generalize a little. So please go ahead.
Maybe Hiba from the perspective of Palestine, no?
I think, to be honest, overall, it's a big question around accountability that is also part of the, Women, Peace and Security agenda, if you will. And that's why you will find some of the national action plans in the region on 1325 cite accountability. Palestine National Action Plan, for instance, has a whole pillar on accountability. And of course, looking at the sort of mechanisms of the implementation of 1325 and subsequent resolutions that together make the WPS agenda and call for women's protection, and of course call on states to be accountable to women's protection and participation during armed conflict. And I have to say that much of the discussions that are taking place now, not only in the Arab states region, but also globally, reiterate, I have to say, the same question. So I'm afraid I don't necessarily have a direct answer to how UN Women is capable to necessarily push that. But the thing that UN Women is doing is definitely offering space for women peace builders, for feminist advocates and actors and leadership, for non-state actors, civil society actors, to convene and come together and discuss the whole issue of documentation of violations, the whole issue of protection, the whole issue of justice, the whole issue of accountability. I've attended the global debate on WPS, and I have to say that all of these questions were asked in different side events, in different convenings around, okay, we've spoken about the agenda, it's almost 24 years this year, but we're about to get to the 25th anniversary of 1325 resolution on women, peace and security. And then we think that we've done enough thinking, and we've done enough advocacy, and we've done enough reflection. We need now implementation, right, of this agenda. And in order for us to implement it, states have to stand by their commitments. And as you mentioned, of course, non-state actors as well. And how can we do that? I mean, I think that this question is asked more often, of course, asked also by Palestinian women's leaders, by Lebanese women's leaders, by Afghani women's leaders, by Libyan and Iraqi. And so it's definitely worth continuing to push, advocate, reflect, and ask for the implementation of this agenda differently. And I leave it there.
This was the last question. So if you want to just say any final remarks, please go ahead.
Well, just to say that I do think that it is not UN Women that does that, right? And there are other mechanisms in the UN system. Roberta knows, and in the multilateral system, Roberta knows them very well. But I do think there is an issue. Of course, the CEDAW committee hears reports from states. Unfortunately, what happens in, I think, places like the person who posed that question is that it relies again on the work of feminist and women's rights groups to push for accountability, even of non-state actors, because the UN in many ways can't. The UN can't even really push for accountability of state actors most of the time. So it is a huge challenge, as Heba said. But yeah, the new mechanisms are required.
So I think we reached the end of our webinar. I will just say that in the webinar's chat, we have some links. So if anyone wants to take a look of some of the relevant references that we posted, please feel free. Please also feel free to check the UNITAR's page and the Diplomats Without Borders as well. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, UNITAR, for giving me the honor of being here with these amazing panelists. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for everything you said. And I hope we can make a change, because if we don't do anything about this gender inequality issue, we can never go forward. So in Africa, I learned the phrase that if we want to go far, we go together. If we want to go fast, we go alone. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'm sorry we just extended like a minute or two. So thank you very much and have an awesome day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Heba. Thank you, Marie-Goretti, Carolina,
Thank
and
you all.
Thank
you.
Bye. Nice meeting you all. Thank you.
Thank you all participants.
Thank you. Bye-bye.